Hello, folks. Jeff Salzman here, and welcome to the Daily Evolver. I've been doing this podcast for about 3 years now, and a couple weeks ago, Brett pointed out to me that I'd produced over 100 episodes. This gave me pause and the opportunity to realize just what a lucky guy I am. I can't imagine doing work that would be more enjoyable and more deeply fulfilling. So I wanted to take a moment with this episode to thank you, my wonderful, faithful listeners, and also to offer a special heartfelt thanks to the one man who is most responsible for the inspiration behind my work, and that's Ken Wilber, who is my guest for the full episode today. For most of you, I imagine Ken needs no introduction, but in case he's new to you, Ken Wilber is one of our leading living philosophers, and through his nearly 30 books and countless talks and teachings, he has created the edifice of modern integral theory, a true theory of everything that is worthy of the term. Through his work, Ken has revealed the deeper dimensions of the prime force that powers the cosmos, the force of evolution, by showing that evolution is not just about the exteriors of the world, about atoms becoming molecules, becoming cells, and cells becoming sponges and fish and reptiles and mammals and ultimately human beings, but that evolution also powers the interior dimensions of the cosmos and is behind the astonishing development of human consciousness and human culture. To bring this down to everyday terms, Ken has shown me something that I attempt to show you every week, that we are evolving creatures in an evolving world. And further, that there's a teleology, a directionality to our evolution, and that we as human beings are indeed developing into higher dimensions of goodness, truth, and beauty. Now, I realize that it doesn't always look that way as we tune into the day's news and see that for so many people and creatures of all kinds, life is anything but good, true, and beautiful. But this points to a deeper, paradoxical truth about evolution. While in its grand historical sweep, evolution is beautiful, in its daily application, it is often not at all pretty. And this realization, of course, calls us to enlist then in the project of creating a more good, true, and beautiful world. And this is perhaps Ken's greatest teaching to me, that in the final analysis, it turns out that we ourselves are evolution in action, and that every thought we think and conversation we have and action we take and vote we cast is an opportunity to contribute to a more intelligent, happy, and loving world. So I thought it fitting as I mark my first 100 episodes of the Daily Evolver to invite the great man himself onto the podcast. I've had the amazing good fortune to work with Ken over the past 10 years, and I know him to be not only the smartest person I've ever met, but also one of the wisest, and totally unexpected to me when I first met him, one of the wittiest. He is indeed a sparkling vehicle for his own teachings. Last week, we got together on the phone to take a look at the world as it is right now today, and to see if we can make some little bit of sense of it. So I invite you to join us. Sit back and enjoy as Ken and I take a tour through this ever-evolving catastrophe called life on planet Earth. And again, thank you so much for listening. It's really great to have you with me as I embark on the next 100 episodes of the Daily Evolver. Thanks, Ken, for joining me on the Daily Evolver podcast.
Congratulations on your 100th.
Yeah, thank you. It's been such a fun thing, and I'm just so grateful to you because, what I'm doing on the Daily Evolver is attempting to use the integral maps that you have developed to look at current events and to look at the movement of history in our time.
Yep.
And
so much of it is so much it can't be understood without using some of those dimensions.
No, I think that's really true. And when I think about, and I've said this to you before, but when I think of what the gift that you've given me and that your work has given so many people is that it allows us to live in a bigger world with more in it, more happening,
more that we can relate to and deal with and see and understand. And then also we see there's a trajectory, that there's a movement towards the good and the true and the beautiful, even if it's not always pretty. You know?
Right.
And speaking of not always pretty, you know, maybe we start with the fact that, you know, here we are 13.8 billion years after the Big Bang, and we're still beheading people.
Oh, God. I mean, it's really spooky. You look at the general unfolding of human consciousness on the whole. And what's so amazing, I mean, on the one hand, there have been an enormous number of strides, and particularly if we just look at strides in the right-hand quadrant, strides in artifacts. Because the thing about artifacts is that it only takes one genius to make an artifact that then a million people can use.
Yeah.
But in terms of where are those million people, they could be at red or amber or orange. They don't have to be, you know, stratospherically highly developed. Right. And so we get this strange mixture of sort of each slow, meandering, broad move up in a general center of gravity of a culture. And we've seen it move slowly from archaic into magic and magic mythic and then mythic and then a little bit rational with the Western Enlightenment and so on. But then you also have these outrageous leaps in artifacts with people who can still be at relatively modest levels of development. So if you look at something, I mean, one of the things that historians had trouble with was in how to interpret modernity, because the postmodernists all looked at it and saw things like Auschwitz and two world wars and all that. And so they just, you know, flat out said things are getting worse, things are getting horrible. But Auschwitz isn't the product of modernity. Auschwitz is the product of tribal consciousness getting their hands on artifacts of modernity. Yeah. If you're at a tribal level, you can only do so much damage with a bow and arrow. But if you get people that can create orange artifacts like, gas ovens, then you can pop off 20,000 people a day.
Yeah.
And so we always are getting these with every growth in consciousness in general. We certainly see higher artifacts being produced, but they can be used by lower and lower levels of development with people's actual interiors. So it's one of the funny things is to actually look at something like a terrorist coming out of an Afghanistan cultural background that are just barely above tribal consciousness, and they're cell phoning each other and making notes on their iPads, and it's just it's outrageous.
No, they're literally tweeting. They're tweeting these beheadings.
Exactly. I mean,
good Lord,
it's insane. It's crazy.
What is this world coming to, Ken?
Well, exactly. And the real problem right now is that we have, there's sort of two, in both the left-hand quadrants and the right-hand quadrants, there's sort of a race going on between sort of disaster and potential enormous kind of breakthroughs. And we see that on both interiors and exteriors. So on the exteriors, of course, we have a race between physical ecological disaster and physical technological breakthroughs. So the disasters include, of course, global warming, and that's not looking good. And I'll come back to that in a minute because that's tied into interiors, which is the real cause of that. But we have global epidemics. There's like an Ebola outbreak in Africa right now, killing 60% of its victims. Worldwide ease of travel makes transmission so easy, like the HIV virus. We face food shortages, water shortages, rising sea levels. Some of this connected with global warming, some of it just on its own. But we're at the first point in history where global physical problems at least threaten humanity's existence. Certainly its comfortable existence.
Yeah.
And that, again, tends to be, in large part, this strange juxtaposition that we see with modernity and postmodernity, which is there can be very high levels of artifact creation, and they can be used by people at any level of moral development. And so somebody at a true world-centric level of moral development is not going to be the head or CEO of a company that's cranking out coal or producing heavy oil productions that are, dumping carbon into the atmosphere at an alarming rate. Somebody that had a world-centric moral sense would not do that.
Right.
So they're getting access to artifacts that were created by world-centric consciousness, but they're being used by egocentric or ethnocentric morals, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
So we have that sort of that whole disastrous possibility that's looming on us for the first time, really, in history. And then also we have possibility of physical technological breakthroughs, so-called singularity. But there are real breakthroughs that we're on the edge of right now in robotics and genomics and nanotechnology, in artificial intelligence. We just had a computer win Jeopardy. The two best Jeopardy players in the world, and that was actually kind of a big deal because there was Big Blue beat Kasparov in chess a couple of decades ago, but people sort of said, well, that's not really that impressive because chess really is just a bunch of logical algorithms. The hard thing is that computers can't understand irony and symbolic and metaphor and all that kind of stuff. But that's what Jeopardy does. And so to create a computer that actually beat the two best Jeopardy players in the world that's sort of something.
Yeah.
There's still enormous ground to cover, but it is an indication that things are continuing to move forward. And a lot of these technological revolutions really do promise to just change society enormously. Even our average physical lifespan could go 100 to 200 years.
Yeah.
And, of course, we haven't even figured out how to handle that economically.
Right.
I mean, we have people retiring at 75 and living to be 150. Who's going to pay for that?
Right.
So,
let me actually get into some of the, even to get back to the problem of modern technology, modern weaponry specifically, in pre-modern hands.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've always sort of taken heart by that you've talked about is that it doesn't take the majority of people at higher levels in order to sort of shift the phase up to those levels. And you use the example of early America, where maybe 10% of the people were modern, but we had a modern constitution, we developed a modern government, and everybody sort of had to fall in line with the modern thinking. So is there any hope there?
Well, that's an interesting phenomena. I had started to notice that when the leading edge of development in any major epic, and the epic is defined as it's a magic epic or a mythic epic, something like that, and the next stage is starting to emerge. So if it's mythic, the next stage is rational, it's starting to emerge, and then if it's a rational culture, the next stage is post-formal or postmodern. And what seemed to happen is that when the leading edge population hit about 10%, that there was a kind of tipping point, and that the values of that leading edge sort of started to saturate the culture. Now, people were still at whatever they were at. They were still at red or they were still at amber, but all of a sudden orange values became something that was sort of a good thing. And they would tend to embrace those values, of course, as they interpreted them. But all of a sudden, with only about 10% of the population at these stages, there were dramatic shifts in culture that actually shifted it from magic into mythic, or largely mythic into rational, that its fundamental governing principles were coming from this leading edge. Mm-hmm. And that's certainly what we see with the emergence of modernity. And we saw that in America, where there's still at least 90% of the population was at amber, at ethnocentric or lower, but about 10% had orange, modern, rational. And that 10% wrote the Constitution, it wrote the Declaration of Independence. We're still, in some ways, at that period, we were still straddling ethnocentric, agrarian, and rational industrial. So the southern states were largely agrarian, and because of that, because ethnocentric has slavery, and rational industrial outlaws slavery. In the 100-year period where every rational industrial society on the face of the planet outlawed slavery, because it comes with world-centric morals, and world-centrically, slavery is wrong. Ethnocentrically, slavery is not only okay, it's sort of the way things are done. It's part of nature, so you're supposed to do that. So you have, upwards of half the founding fathers, certainly virtually all the ones from the southern states, have slaves. So you have somebody like Jefferson, probably one of the weirdest of the lot, because he's writing so much about, democracy and freeing men, and all men being born equal and all of that, but owning slaves.
Yeah.
So the United States.
Well, not only that, Ken, he'd probably be a serial rapist.
Yeah, he was
in our society.
Yeah,
and yet he writes the Declaration of Independence. It's just astonishing.
I know it is. It is. And the United States were, unfortunately, we were born as a country in exactly that 100-year period that slavery was being outlawed. And so what we got stuck essentially with two countries.
Good point.
An ethnocentric slavery, fundamentalist believing Southern culture, and a northern rational industrial agnostic type of culture that led to a civil war, and it still hasn't fundamentally disappeared. We still have those two fundamental cultures in this country.
Yeah.
But the thing about the 10% is that we saw the same thing happen with post-modernity. That in 1959, the percentage of the population at green was about 2 to 3%, and by 1979, Jacques Derrida was the most frequently quoted academic writer in America, and we had somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population at green, and today it's somewhere between 20 and 25%. But so it hits 10, and we have the student riots starting in Paris, May 1968, sort of the official beginning of postmodernity, and those spread, around the world, and certainly had a warm welcome in America. And then all of a sudden, things that were sort of okay in 1950s culture, like you're working at a big corporate office, and you're going by the water cooler, and a woman's bending over getting a drink of water or something, and you slap her on the ass, and she kind of ha-ha, and everybody sort of ha-ha, and nobody thinks anything about it. Now you try doing that in 1978, and you get arrested. So even though not at least 80% of the population is not at those levels, those values have sunk down.
Yeah.
And you can certainly see that, for example, from Stonewall to legal marriage.
Yeah.
Astonishing.
Amazing. In my lifetime as a gay man, I can't. Stonewall. I think I was 14, and now gay marriage in 19 states, and it's basically the whole edifice is crumbling. It's here.
Amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And yet you still have, the percentage of population that is at some of those levels is still relatively modest.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing, and I've started seeing ever since I sort of kind of published this just sort of overview of about a 10% tipping point kind of thing. I've had several people send me results of certain studies that have been done, like at Stanford and so on, and they're showing that when 10% of a population changes its mind into a particular topic, that's enough to get a majority of the population to change its mind.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know exactly what all the details are on that, but the general notion that we do have sort of going in our favor is that it does look like when the leading edge hits about 10% or certainly more, that there tends to be a diffusion of its values throughout the culture. And that's, of course, what we see. I mean, when we talk about the Western Enlightenment and modernity and all of that, even if only 20% or even 30%, I mean, I think Robert Keegan in Over Our Heads gives a pretty dismal percentage for America. He said 3 out of 5 people weren't at levels of modern thinking. In other words, that weren't at orange. In other words, 60% of the population was ethnocentric or lower. And it's usually you hear a little bit more like Spiral Dynamics will put the percentage of people in America at orange at around 50%, for example. But wherever it is, those values of individual freedom and equality and so on tend to be sort of deeply etched into American culture now. The problem is that as we look worldwide, and another thing that modern historians got wrong because they didn't understand more integral views was every modern historian and virtually all the modern philosophers said that religion would die. Yeah. And they said that because they watched the rational orange level emerge from the mythic amber. And pretty much everybody who developed rationality gave up on mythic religion and just found it kind of silly and, right up there with the Tooth Fairy and Santa Claus and all of that. But everybody overlooked the fact that people are still born at square one. Everybody still has to go through the whole developmental sequence. So every time one person is moving from mythic, amber, ethnocentric into orange, modern, rational, 2 people are moving into it. So it's kind of keeping, a whole pool of as people move out of lower stages, but they're also moving into it.
Right.
And every time somebody someplace is making love, they're getting ready to make a little Nazi. Because they're going to have to go through that stage.
I know. No, that's right. Well, Ken, so bringing this forward to today. So, looking again globally.
Yeah.
Isn't there a pretty good percent? And I've heard you say 5. I've heard you say different numbers, I think. But
yeah.
A percent of people who are operating at least a functional integral stage.
Right.
And I think that's actually, those people, of course, are concentrated at the highest levels of achievement, in a sense. I mean, in terms of government, NGOs, business, so forth. Right. They're really the people who are pulling the levers of power. They have to be almost. You almost could make the argument that you can't be a successful global leader of an organization and not be at least functionally teal. Is there some hope here?
Yeah. Part of what we're looking at is that even with 70% of the world's population at ethnocentric or lower, amber or lower, we do have a fair number of people that are continuing to move into these higher levels. And when the book Spiral Dynamics first came out, for example, they estimated the percentage worldwide population of people at turquoise was 0.5%, and teal was 3 to 4%.
Okay.
And that's Beck thinks that that's overall gone up to at least 5%. I think that's at least correct. And the point is that we are moving towards that 10% tipping point, and that's going to be a really extraordinary period. And because the simple reason here is that if it's true that when the leading edge hits 10%, there's a kind of perfusion of its values throughout the culture, a kind of a diffusion of its values in a way that they become sort of more acceptable, or even something that people would tend to choose. Integral values are radically different than any sort of values that we have ever seen in any stage of development in any of humanity's history, ever.
Wow.
There's all of the first tier stages are exclusionary. Every single one of them thinks that their values and their values alone are true. And then all of a sudden you get what Claire Graves calls monumental leap of meaning into second tier. And then all of a sudden stages think that every single previous stage is important. It has some significance. It's there for some reason. It's important. You can't get rid of it, because human growth and development on the whole depends on each of these stages, just like you can't go from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms and skip molecules. That doesn't work. So even though you have some of these lower stages, there's still a crucial stepping point in overall human growth and development. So for the first time, we have stage of development that thinks other stages of development are important and deserve to be included in an overall human existence. That's never happened before. We don't have.
You have to admit that's pretty radical, isn't it?
It's outrageous.
I mean,
we
that alone.
Just never seen it. It's wild. I mean, green is sort of, I think I'm sort of halfway to integral. It wants to be integral. It calls itself the integral culture. It doesn't want to marginalize anybody. But green hates second tier. Green loathes orange. Green can't stand amber. Green, weirdly, loves red, because it does a pre-post thing, and thinks that all those pre-conventional types are really post-conventional. So it sort of snuggies up with them. But generally speaking, it just doesn't get to a really inclusionary stance. It won't do that because it doesn't understand holarchies and how you actually get transcend and include, and therefore you can actually make broader and broader, wider and wider, bigger and bigger networks. So it just kind of ends up in a fractionated, fragmented, partial, broken stance that falls apart in nihilism and just sort of doesn't really go anywhere. But all that would change with that monumental leap of meaning, and the values that we we don't have any indication of how to build a culture that's really inclusive. It's never been done before, ever. The idea wasn't even accepted before. So this is going to be a very, very interesting shift. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that let me just run this by you, Ken, and see what you think.
Yeah.
So here we have this ISIS, this Islamic fundamentalist movement that's, sweeping this part of Syria and Iraq and putting heads on spikes and all of that sort of thing.
Yep.
The rest of the world is only going to tolerate so much of that, I'm thinking. And there is a certain integral response to that Or maybe it's just a modern response to that. I don't know. I get a little confused here. But this isn't the Third Reich. These people aren't really going to prevail in terms of any kind of world domination. Or they're not even going to be long for this world, as far as I can tell. I think they underestimate the meat grinder they've just sort of provoked that's coming their way. So I don't know. How do you interpret that in terms of an integral response versus? I don't know. What do you? I'm confused. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, part of the difficulty is that our common wisdom in our common culture doesn't really have any sort of explicit understanding of very much of the realities of the interior dimensions.
Yeah.
So everything we can see with our eyes, we believe in. And anything in the sensorimotor world, we can believe in. So we'll believe in the exteriors of all those interiors. We believe in a triune brain. And we'll believe in stages of physical development that the triune brain goes through. But the correlates on the left-hand quadrants, which is stages of growth in consciousness, we just don't know about those. Because that, we can't see those out there running around someplace. And so it's a notoriously not known dimension of human reality, and yet it's the cause of 60-70% of human actions. And so we remain ignorant about the cause of the majority of things that we see in our world. I mean, it's really like 96% of the universe being dark matter. What the hell is that? I mean, it could be like dragons and angels and shit going on. We have no idea. But it's 96%. I mean, that it's the same thing with interiors. That's just more dark matter. And most world leaders, most thought leaders, most university professors have no bloody idea of the stages that each of their multiple intelligences went through as it got to wherever it is they are. And they think that the way they see the world, if they're orange, the way they see an orange world, if they're green, the way they see a green world, if they're teal, the way they see a teal world, they think that orange, green, and teal world is just the way it is. Right. That's the way the world is. That's it. And I'm thinking about it accurately, and I'm reflecting it accurately. And people that are like mythic or magic, they're just not seeing the real world right.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing it right, and so on. So because of that, people don't have a way that they can get an accurate assessment of what something like a amber extreme fundamentalist, what their worldview is really like, what they're coming from, what they're willing to do, the limitations of how they see the world, and the extremely driven and narrow motivations that they have. And so we just keep assuming that they haven't really got, human values and democratic values, and they just don't understand good old Western Enlightenment values. And so they're stuck in some sort of primitive, 2,000-year-old civilization. And that, again, fails to understand that everybody's born at square one, and we have fresh versions of these levels being produced daily. So the fact is that things like magic and mythic, there were periods in our past where they predominated, is true. But they're not just something from the past, because we have modern people going through them now. We have present-day people going through these stages. And so whenever you find a belief structure that happens to resonate with a particular stage of development that a human goes through, then it becomes a very strong attractor for that person's center of gravity.
Yeah.
And so when you have 70% of the world's population at amber or lower levels, then amber belief systems which were really prevalent 2,000 years ago, but are still everywhere today in all sorts of ways, then it becomes very attractive for people to undergo, in a sense, arrested development at those stages and really hang out there and really believe them aggressively. And so it doesn't matter if you have a Southern Baptist blowing up abortion clinics in the South, or Buddhist group putting sarin gas in the Tokyo subway system, or Sikh separatists, or Sinhalese Buddhists attacking Tamil Hindus in Sri Lanka. All of these fundamentalist organizations, Hamas, Hezbollah, I mean, they're everywhere. And unfortunately, those still have an enormous attraction to individuals in those subgroups, in those cultures.
Yeah, even if they're coming from Britain or America, as we see.
Absolutely. That's because one of the things about these various levels of development is that their deep structures are identical cross-culturally.
Yeah.
So you can come in at amber from any other culture and still really resonate with the amber deep structures of any culture that you're at.
Yeah.
And so that's a real problem. And one of the biggest problems about that problem is because humanity doesn't really recognize or acknowledge interiors, we don't know what the cause of that problem is.
Yeah.
And because we don't know what the cause is, we don't know what to do about it effectively. Yeah. And so we don't. And so it's some 300 years since at least world-centric universal rights of humankind were introduced. And less than 30% of the worldwide population is at those stages. So that's kind of a little bit slow. And it's, again, a testament to the fact that everybody's born at square one.
Yeah.
And has to go through all these things. And people can get derailed, sidestepped, stopped at any stage of that development. And so that's one of the problems that we're looking at. And it impacts everything. It impacts our politics. It impacts, one of the first things that we should do in our educational system is, because people don't have trouble saying, there's 1 to 12 grades. That's the one area where everybody sort of allows levels are okay.
Yeah.
And they sort of make sense, and it's not putting somebody down to say they're in 7th grade. It just means that they're in 7, they can keep going, and there's nothing wrong with that, nothing to be embarrassed about or anything like that. If you dropped out at 7th grade, and then as an adult had a 7th grade education, then that would be a little bit problematic. But what we don't realize is that there are people, in terms of developmental interiors, that in a sense drop out at 7th grade.
Yeah.
And they're adults.
I think it's one of the challenges of integral is that, as you just said, people get development when it comes to children. That's
exactly.
It's too obvious to miss.
Exactly.
But the idea that there are cultures that are, relatively, you don't want to use the word childish, but they're basically at a stage of development that is the same as a 12-year-old.
That's right.
Or a 16-year-old. Or
that's exactly right. Or a 7-year-old.
Or a 7-year-old. Yeah.
And
that we adults realize that we can't let them have missiles. And
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And it starts to come down to the point about if we were going to have a worldwide democracy and there was like a green world federation and it believed in egalitarianism, that everybody's absolutely equal, no differences whatsoever, and therefore we're going to institute one person, one vote, instant worldwide democracy. Then, even in the United States, if we did that, Kansas would outlaw the teaching of evolution. It's already tried it. It's already tried it twice.
Yeah. We don't need direct democracy. Well, which brings me to, you've sometimes talked about, so what, if we look at governmental structures.
Yeah.
Democracy isn't the end of the road. Certainly, direct democracy. I mean, even representative democracy is better than direct democracy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And one of the things that I think
what's to come.
Well, that's the thing, and it depends entirely on how much of awareness of interior stages of development starts to become relatively well known and well understood in culture at large. And I think one of the first things that needs to be done to help that is for us to start. I mean, we acknowledge, well, I say grades 1 through 12. We acknowledge at least 12 levels of getting a human being up to what we consider a minimal amount of development to let them participate in a modern democracy. And one of the things that would help is if those levels were started to be identified by not just the skills that they teach, because skills depend upon levels of development, different skills at different levels. But they can identify it with skills. I mean, because there's always this big movement to have national testing for skills at a particular grade. So everybody at grade 4 needs to know these skills, and everybody at grade 7 needs to know these skills, and we test them for it. And all there's always that kind of movement because there are certain things are recommended, and because certain schools don't do as well as others, and so on. But if we also started identifying what altitude a particular grade was meant to bring forth.
Yeah.
So red and magenta, I mean infrared, magenta, red, amber, and into orange and green. Those basic stages, levels of consciousness would be expected. That's what high school would attempt to deliver to each human being. Is that when you got your diploma, you would also get your interior little marker, and it would say at least orange. And if you managed to get to green or teal, then you would get a teal or a green little marker.
Yeah.
And so we would start to understand that these first to 12 grades aren't just something that kids go through, but that adults can be at.
Right, absolutely.
And so if we started to understand what amber meant, we would look at a culture like Iraq or Iran or Afghanistan. We would say amber. And that would change how we approach that dramatically. First, we'd stop trying to dump green values into their system and see them just continue to elect the next military dictator. And we would have an understanding about red cultures and what it takes for them to actually be held together as a culture. Green democracy is not it. So if we just started to make those simple connections by our own educational upbringing, it doesn't strike me as a terribly huge leap to do something like that, because we can just present it as these are the vertical stages of development that we expect every school grade to reach. This is part of our national testing. And so, so if somebody was, got into 12th grade and was still at red, there would be remedial classes on interior development, helping that person get up to orange. And that would, in itself, would be extraordinary, because one of the things that would do is get people through that glass ceiling of world-centric, because virtually all human conflicts in the world today are one ethnocentric group versus another ethnocentric group. That's what most, and it's just crazy, but you see it, everywhere. I mean, and that's what we're looking at. And one of the biggest problems is that, most of the people at ethnocentric are owned they belong to one of the world's great religions, and the great religion in its fundamentalist ethnocentric version.
Well, if we look at the world as a whole, we see that, there's certainly many people in America, let's even say 50, 60%, who are at the amber stage or prior. But they're contained in a modern system, a postmodern system.
Exactly.
Where it's really running amok is the Middle East,
right.
And particularly in this one, hot zone.
Yep.
And we still have Africa. It's a big continent, and a lot of it's, amber, modern, whatever, but there's still a lot that's pre-modern there.
Yep.
But other than that, even China, where we have maybe, 90% of the people are pre-modern, but there's this skin, there's this, strata on top. I mean, it's remarkable and astonishing to me that that's how it works, that China can be a civilized partner in world relations for the most part.
Right.
When it has such an ocean of people who are at the pre-modern stage of development. And, I find that encouraging.
Well, it is, and it's one
really
of the oddities.
with a trailing edge.
Yeah, it's one of the oddities about China and a couple of places like that. The Soviet Union, for a while, when it broke up into ethnocentric clans.
Yeah.
And then that started out to be basically warlord versus warlord, and that sort of whole process went on. A lot of people that see Putin as not much more than an ethnocentric warlord. And of course, the whole Ukraine-Russia thing is an ethnocentric conflict again. But in China, you had this bizarre thing where something called Western Marxism, which in itself is a orange or green philosophy, and so you had totalitarian versions of that coming in, and with fairly low motives. You can sort of look at their multiple intelligences and draw a psychograph out that distinguishes a little bit between just their cognitive capacity, which is quite high, the technological capacity is quite high, interpersonal capacity fairly high, and you just get to morals and say not quite as high maybe, but there is that totalitarian rational sector sitting on top, strangely putting a clamp on the magic and mythic stuff below it.
Yeah.
So
pretty effectively.
Pretty effectively, and so that can happen. You see essentially similar types of things happening in India, but India also has this very peculiar mix of having fairly high state development in certain ways. So there are a lot of people at mythic, but there are also a lot of people that are mythic causal or mythic turiya or mythic non-dual. And so that makes it just a little gentler than China, which is what they're sitting on is sort of a Mongol invasion mentality.
Right.
And so, but all of that is where we really see problems are where you get countries where the leadership is essentially ethnocentric, and then the people they're leading are essentially ethnocentric, and then you get essentially a Muslim world.
Yeah.
And it just for many weird and bizarre reasons, one of the strange ones was probably oil, because with the glut of oil that most Islamic countries had, they sort of bought their way around interior development.
Yeah.
It just wasn't necessary for them.
Well, it's interesting. The Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they were Bedouin. They were nomads. 100 years ago? Not even.
Yeah.
I mean, they were in a between magic and mythic stage of development, and all of a sudden they're brought into modernity, and they fly around in their jets.
I know.
With their women shrouded in burqas.
I know. It's that strange artifact separation again. and they have some of the world's finest architects building these extraordinarily modern and postmodern buildings, and their whole infrastructure, their country, is built by people at very high cognitive, usually second-tier cognitive development and technological capacities at second tier, and their interiors are just dragging right across the ground.
Isn't emergence amazing? I mean, here we are at 2014, and we're spanning everything from almost magenta. I mean, we could argue about that, but up to, in terms of cultures, certainly green and a lot of let me just ask you this, Ken. So let's say that we have 5% of the world population at integral.
Right.
Where do you see it? Do you see it in any public figures? Do you see it in any art forms? Do you see it culturally? What's sparking to you?
Well, what's interesting is because I know a fair number of well-known people that have read my stuff and either hear about it or they actually contact me.
Yeah.
And so I know directly that they're interested in this. And these are people that are well known. It's like the Wachowski brothers or Michael Crichton or George Lucas, or even in Hollywood. I mean, even Sharon Stone and Julia Ormond, Alanis Morissette, Minnie Driver, Brad Pitt,
of course,
Angelina
Bill and Hillary
Jolie,
Clinton, Al Gore.
Hillary Clinton, absolutely. And Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie used to read my stuff to each other.
Well, she wanted to do your Grace and Grit as a movie for years.
Indeed,
she was working on that.
And she agreed to that. So I happen to know them. If I didn't know them, I wouldn't know that they're interested in that. And that's because Integral hasn't yet self-identified. In other words, there's because still at around 5%, most people that are integral don't know they're integral. And all they know is that they sort of see things, they try to explain it to their friends don't quite get it, so they start to get that kind of, blank deer and headlight look and that kind of thing. And then sometimes they'll read one of my books and lights will go off. They'll just go, this is it. I could have written this book. And they recognize it. They're not getting new ideas. They're saying, I knew this. I could have done this. Okay, he did it first, but I could have done this. And it's just everything, lights go off, and it's said. And then they start bugging their friends with the books. And then their friends start avoiding them because, here he comes with 12 more of that Wilbur guy's books. And so we don't have people that are at traditional values, and you sort of say traditional values, and they'll go, I'm family values, that's me, traditional values. And if you say somebody's modernity and modern, they know they have modern values, and somebody who's postmodern generally knows that they're multicultural and they know what that means, and so those are all well over 10%, and they've all self-identified, and the media knows what they are, and the media all has their opinions formed about all of them, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody knows what integral is, except that it is showing up in an awful lot of specific thought leaders in specific areas. When this Ukraine project came up, we really saw people come out of the woodwork.
Tell us, Ken, a little bit about what I know. You're really involved in the Ukrainian situation, and tell us a little bit about what's actually going on there.
Yeah, well, it started with one particular person and then kind of spread. And there was, starting as recent as like in January, there was a group of integral theorists in Ukraine, and they started a project called The New Country. And it started with about 16 people in it. And today there's over 2,000 people in it.
Wow.
And they have written integral positions on 15 or 16 different topics or areas, everything from business to education to religion, family, government, etc. And so that's obviously something that I'm supporting. I think they're doing a really, really great job there. And then they've actually given a 2-hour presentation to Poroshenko, Ukrainian's new president.
Right.
So that's starting to have, get a bit of traction. And what happened when people heard that we were specifically asked by some leading Ukrainian politicians to, quote, help rebuild Ukraine from ground up based on integral principles. At the end of that week, I had over 200 emails in my email box from people all over the world that heard about this and wanted to participate in it somehow. And so we've got a real hint of just how many people there are out there that, after, say, if you take, let's say, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, 1995, so that's close to 20 years that it's had a chance to kind of circulate a bit. And so it's certainly gone through all of Hollywood and a lot of education. Strangely, a fair number of politicians have done this. Al Gore, called one of the books his favorite new book, and Bill Clinton quotes this stuff all the time. Karl Rove got a presentation. He actually used it for his compassionate conservatism. Newt Gingrich uses one of my books, and they're Florida's Values. Of course, Jeb Bush does. But we had people like, we were asked to write on national security from an integral perspective. And one of the people that ended up coming into view was the head of probably the world's largest security firm. They already have 600 people on the ground in Ukraine alone. And he says, he loves integral. And it turns out that he had gotten some coaching from a consulting firm that uses the Aqua frame for their consulting framework. And so he had learned the framework a long time ago and was still using it. So he said he loves integral. And so he would love to, give a presentation on security from an integral perspective. And so we've got, in terms of people that are in comparable positions like that, head of the world's largest clothing firm on the net, the world's in all of Britain banking system, on and on and on. We've got some 20 of them that are doing presentations on integral approaches to these specific areas. And so that was a real indication of how many people are really out there using this in their own sort of quiet way.
Yeah.
And so
absolutely.
as the population continues to grow, 5%, 6%, 7%, it's going to hit that 10%, and right about that tipping point, then the integral culture worldwide will self-identify. And
that's really, you're saying that's the factor that will really sort of presage the tipping point.
It'll change. I think that's a real game changer. Because, again, the problem is if you've got, at the minimum, these 4 quadrants of reality, not to mention levels and lines and all that, but just taking the 4 quadrants. And we have the 2 exterior quadrants that everybody believes in, and the 2 interior quadrants that nobody knows anything about. And so our approaches to pretty much any problem in the world can guaranteed to be half-assed, more or less literally. and so we are a history of a broken humanity. We've never included just all 4 quadrants, let alone all levels and all lines, states. So part of the wickedness of the world's wicked problems, and the reason they stay wicked, is that everybody does everything they can in the right-hand quadrants. They bring in all the technological solutions, and they think of all the systems theory stuff they can do, and they work on all of that, and they work on all of that, and then they sit back and they take their hands off, and it falls apart. Yeah. And it falls apart because they're pushing a world-centric notion, which 70% of the population doesn't understand world-centric. They're ethnocentric. World-centric is literally over their heads. So the people at ethnocentric, they don't believe in global warming. They don't even believe it exists because they can't see it.
Yeah.
And so who are the climate deniers? The far right-wing, ultra-conservatives, any fundamentalist religious believer, in other words, any ethnocentric, amber, mythic believer, can't see world-centric systems. It's literally over their head, so it doesn't exist. So we have all of these interior factors going on and responsible for everything, like why there are people beheading people and doing tweets about it, and why something like Israel and Palestine has virtually every conceivable dimension possible in conflict. I mean, there are a clash at different civilization blocks. Horizontally, there are clash at different levels. There are different lines generally involved, different states involved. It's made to order for a conflict-generating machine.
Yeah.
And yet, half of the factors that are going into this, and it's actually more in terms of the weight that they get, but half the factors going into this aren't known, acknowledged, understood, or talked about.
Yeah.
And we can't figure out why we don't get anywhere.
Yeah.
But I mean,
but yet we've gotten somewhere. I mean, if you look at human violence, and I think in some ways the headline is that we have 95% of the people living in peace, maybe 99% of the people living in peace on the planet.
Well, it's definitely true. I mean, Pinker wrote his book on aggression as continually declining, and all of that's true. I mean, if you take a really long view of human history, things continually get better. They get more true and more good and more beautiful and more complex and more conscious and on and on. And that's an inherent tendency of the cosmos. It's one of the fundamental, that eros is one of the fundamental forces that's an intrinsic part of the actual existing universe.
And we want to notice that as we integralists sort of, interpret the world.
Well, exactly. And what we really would like is the world to also understand this a little bit more. and so that's what we're looking for. And that's why I think that the tipping point when 10% hits integral is going to really be a big game changer. Because, again, it's like the stock market. On the long haul, it always goes up.
Right.
But that doesn't stop there being, Great Depressions and really nasty turn of events. We just got, another Gaza Strip, 2,000 people dead in the last few months. I mean, they're still at each other's throats and have been ever since Israel was instituted. There are always those kinds of places, and Islamic fundamentalism is just really dug in. There's that kind of problem, and it's still true that on balance aggression is going down, and things are there's certain ways that things are getting better and better, but it's going to get better when we really do have this tipping point where all of the dimensions of a human being start to be put on the table.
Yeah, we could say that arguably, because the U.S., maybe Western Europe's half a stage beyond us or whatever, but let's just look at the U.S. So we have this great polarization now where we have, basically 2/3 of Republicans think that Democrats are dangerous to the Union and vice versa. So we have this, sort of paralysis in Congress, and, is there something that's fruitful about this? Is there something that pops us into a new stage? Is this sort of the nature of emergence itself, or are we just like fucking up?
Well, here's a really far out way that you could start to think about what future democracy might look like.
Okay.
Because right now, the way it is it's based on essentially, a pure egalitarianism: one person, one vote. Now, that has to be handled very carefully, because if you're ever going to try to change something like that, then you have to have, rules for evidence and truthfulness are going to have to be extremely high if you're going to replace that with some alternative kind of system. But let's say that we had, for a century or so, had educational systems that recognized that their job was to raise people up in their levels of development, in addition to teaching them skills. So it was understood that at this particular grade, you had mastered infrared, and at this particular stage, you'd mastered magenta, and this particular stage, you'd mastered red, and this particular grade, you mastered at amber, and then at graduation, you were orange or possibly higher.
Mm-hmm.
And we had been thinking like that for some time. We'd started to sort of look at other cultures through those lens. We started to look at our own citizens through those lens, and so on. Then in at least some sort of testing areas, we might do something like give somebody at red 1 vote, somebody at amber 2 votes, somebody at orange. get a vote for every perspective you can take.
Yeah. Oh,
so
my goodness.
Wow. Red has
good.
1 perspective, it gets 1 vote. Amber has 2nd perspective, it gets 2. Orange has 3rd person, it gets 3. Green has 4, it gets 4 votes. Teal gets 5 votes. Turquoise gets 6 votes, and third tier gets 7 votes. And so let us use those in certain circumstances and try it out and see what kind of results start happening.
Yeah.
When we actually give not a physical body a vote, but a consciousness perspective a vote. That's what should be important.
Yeah.
And otherwise, your Mother Teresa and Jack the Ripper are essentially getting treated the same, and there's something that's just a little bit off about that.
Yeah, no, it's true. But you can, of course, see the problems of implementing something like that. But
totally.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where maybe I see we're getting on the end of our time here. But if we think about, just even wild-ass guesses about the future, and some of what might arise here and what's next, where do you see? So here I sort of said it kind of glibly at the beginning. We're 13.8 billion years into this adventure.
Yeah.
Where are we at 13.80001? What's next? It's happening pretty fast. What do you see? Where do you see humanity in maybe 20 years, 50 years? I don't know, 100 years.
Sure.
How do we think about that?
Yeah, my sense is that in 20 years we're gonna have hit that 2nd tier tipping point, and so people are going to start, and it'll be slow, but they're going to start paying attention to interior degrees of development. Yeah. And as people continue to think that way and see that it just fits a whole lot of world circumstances that didn't make sense before, and that it just starts to make sense in a lot of ways. And when they see the actual evidence, most of the dimensions in the alchemical framework aren't well known. And that's why it's so useful, because most of them have been discovered and developed and understood by small knowledge communities. But in those knowledge communities, there's an enormous amount of evidence, and nobody doubts the reality of these things. And there's a very broad sort of consensus in these knowledge communities about what these dimensions are and what they mean, what they're doing, and how they grow and develop, and so on. And so as that sort of continues to become known, and people can sort of start to trust that kind of knowledge, I think we're also going to see a corresponding growth in an understanding of brain structure. And I think one of the things that's going to start to happen, certainly about 50 years from now, is that we're going to start having brain-computer links. So we're going to
brain,
start
computer. What were you saying?
Linkages.
Okay, links. Yeah. Interesting.
And so, I mean, Kurzweil even counts that as part of the singularity, that the next generation of kids will have implants in their brain where they can download anything from the web. So, in a sense, the world's entire knowledge base would be available to every human being.
Yeah.
And now what is going to have to come with that is a way to arrange that knowledge. And that means we're going to have levels of development, because different levels see different things. And so just the fact that somebody has all that information dumped in them doesn't mean they're going to be able to cognize it or understand it. So somebody at RAD would be able to understand just really first-person, egocentric things, and somebody at AMBER would be second-person, and so on. But I think we're going to start to have these brain-mind, brain-computer linkages. And at some point, we might even get to the point where we can tell from brain scanning what a person's mind space is. So we could start to see certain structures in their mind. So by taking brain scans, we would be able to certifiably say, yes, this person is orange, or this person is green, or this person is turquoise, or this person is indigo. And it would come with a certain amount of authority, and people would tend to trust it. And I keep saying we would have had a century of looking at our educational system as producing higher levels of consciousness, because I think it's going to take a century to get used to that. But once that happens, it's just second nature that people will say, well, so-and-so's at RAD, and so, watch out for this, or, oh, you want to set somebody up with my daughter, well, she's a turquoise, so you should, think about that. Or, I mean, it'll just become part of what we take into account about another human being. They're this tall, they weigh this much, they work at this job, they're at this level of consciousness, and so on. But once that starts happening, then we would start experimenting with different governance systems. Right now, what's on the leading edge is simply a world federation of everybody, one person, one vote. And so we have to be very, very careful about that. Because, again, even if we had one person, one vote in this country, because, according to Keegan, less than 30% are at world-centric, we are going to get things like, the South would reintroduce segregated restaurants and segregated restrooms. And, I mean, they think that way now. If it was a one-person, one vote, they would do it. Kansas would outlaw the teaching of evolution, and I mean, on and on and on. So the reason we have representative democracy and things like Supreme Courts is that we intuitively understand that some people are better at these things, they're higher developed at these things, and can make better decisions than other people. Except if you get a really idiotic ethnocentric senator like Nebraska's great Senator Roman Ruska, when they were trying to choose Supreme Court justice. And the most common complaint about this one justice is that he was mediocre. And Ruska got up on the Senate floor and defended him by actually saying, don't mediocre people deserve representing?
Well, that's very democratic.
Exactly. That's the problem. I mean, Plato wrote the first critique of democracy. He put it at one of the lowest levels of democracy we have. And his critique is still valid. It's the lowest common denominator, and it produces nothing but demagogues. I mean, it's right. It gives everybody a vote. It doesn't take into account differences in minds at all. We can't think of ways to do that differently now. I can't think of ways to do that differently now, but I can at least think of ways that it could be done differently if certain other things were kind of in place, and we had a chance to get that up and going. So that's what I tend to see in terms of the far future, is that when you have these dimensions of reality that are very real, and they are impacting us all the time, and we don't know it, as soon as humanity learns about it, they tend to believe it, they take it seriously, and they start changing their behavior. So every time, I mean, this is something that could go on, the Cosmos series or something. But every time some new piece of information that really has evidence and is believed is introduced into a culture, it takes it seriously and it starts using it and it starts acting as if that's true. These dimensions are so significant and so important, and they're governing so much of our lives. It just can't keep going that we don't take that into account. Humans can't keep overlooking the major force of their own motivations, and the major force of their own drives and desires and needs. They just can't keep overlooking that. And so when I think down the future, I think that kind of stuff is going to come online. And then, wow, that's going to change stuff.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I have to say, and this is maybe over-expanding our conversation here a little bit, but good Lord, Ken, would we look at the nature of emergence since the Big Bang, and certainly in the last, 500,000 years, and all of humanity?
Yeah.
God, there's so much suffering, and dog eat dog, and you realize, I mean, even using developmental theory, putting heads on spikes is actually progress over people who didn't know how to put heads on spikes, but
I
still,
know.
cut off. I mean, what's the nature of God, if you will, or what's the nature of the intelligence, or I'm trying to figure out how to relate to the intelligence behind evolution and emergence, looking at the biggest picture that includes so much pain. And, I know this has been, beflummoxing philosophers for centuries, but what do you have to say about it?
Well, one of the simplest ways to go at something like this is to simply look at what's the actual nature of moment-to-moment experience, such that the world can actually manifest and exist. I mean, what has to actually happen from moment to moment in order for existence to occur at all? That's a classic philosophical kind of thing to ask. But we can look at one of my favorite, and I incorporate this as part of my own response, is Whitehead's view about this. Mm-hmm. And for Whitehead, each moment came to be, each drop of experience, each moment came to be and was a subject of experience. Mm-hmm. And that subject felt the previous moment, or what he called prehended. Mm-hmm. So this subject comes into being, it prehends the previous subject, now that makes that an object. Mm-hmm. So the previous subject prehends, the present subject prehends the previous subject, which now becomes an object, but of course it's included as part of the present subject as well, because if you embrace something, feel something, put your arms around it, so then that's affecting you. That's having an impact on you. So that was the causal part of the past. That's how the past had some impact on the present, how the past to some extent determines the present, because each present is prehending or feeling or incorporating or including the previous moment. And so, of course, it's going to impact it or make some sort of influence on it. But then each present moment, after prehending the previous moment, it then adds its own bit of novelty, its own creativity. And novelty means that, fresh, new, something that never existed before. So that just means out of this creative well, out of this vast eros, a little bit of newness comes into being and is part of that present moment. Now, Whitehead said that if the novelty part is really, really, really low, then it'll look like strict causality, because very little new gets added moment to moment. So if you watch atoms interacting with each other and they're banging into each other, it looks pretty strict causality. Mm-hmm. But the universe went from a point where there was just nothing but atoms banging into each other until at one point those atoms grew together and jumped into becoming molecules, something very new. So there was some novelty that was accumulating at that atomic level, or it'd never be able to jump into molecules. So now we've got molecules. Now kind of banging into each other and not adding a great deal of novelty. So it sort of still looks a little bit deterministic. Until at one point, millions of years later, a whole group of very complex molecules were in the same vicinity, and a cell wall dropped around them, and you get a living cell, which is staggering.
Oh
creative
my God.
Leap. Unbelievable. So now cells, they don't look so deterministic because they're starting to show their own reactions. And so any physicist can tell you where Jupiter will be 500 years from now, but no biologist will tell you where a yeast cell will be 2 minutes from now. It's just little degrees of freedom are getting added as this thing goes up. But each of these is transcending and including its predecessor. And so that's what has to happen, is that in order for this moment to come into being, it has to feel the previous moment.
Yeah.
But then in order for any creativity to happen at all, then it has to add a little bit of novelty. Now, I think that happens in all four quadrants. But what that does mean, and we say, therefore each moment is transcends and includes. And that means the subject of each moment becomes the object of the subject of the next moment. We hear Keegan say in human development that the best way to summarize human development that I know is that the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. It's still going on. They're still transcending and including. And there's not a single holon that's been produced going all the way back to the Big Bang that isn't still in existence today.
Wow.
Because it's still getting included.
Yeah.
So quarks are still here. Atoms are still here. Molecules are still here. Cells are still here. Human beings have every one of those in them. We transcend and include. We have atoms in us. We have quarks in us. We have cells in us. All of that. We transcend and include every single stage of evolution that has ever come into existence in 14 billion years. And that's why we come and you look at the whole 14 billion years as a one-year calendar, then human beings are like in the last day, in the last hour, in the last few minutes.
Yeah.
Because we had to transcend and include everything that came before.
Yeah.
The problem part is that then we get into humans and they're transcending and including. It means that as our own history gets thicker and thicker and thicker, there are more and more levels to us. There are also, therefore, more and more things that can break down, more and more things that can go wrong. Right now, for a human being to get to a green level of development, there are at least 6 or 7 major levels, stages that they have to go through to get there. And something can go pathological at every one of those stages. Mm-hmm. That means human beings have at least 6 or 7 ways to get really psychologically fucked up.
Yeah.
You go back to tribes. The person was born infrared, and to become an adult, they just had to make it to magic. There was only one way you could get screwed up in tribal times. We can get sick in ways that tribes couldn't even imagine, and we do.
Yeah.
And so what happens with this whole complexity is this extraordinary mixture of high and low that gets thrown together. And that's what makes existence so absolutely weird for us. It's what we were saying earlier about Auschwitz, about tribal mentality with modern artifacts. Yeah. What is that but an indication of that extraordinary mixture of high and low? And everybody is still born at square one, which means that even if we get to supermind in the future, all that really means there'll be 12 ways to get totally fucked.
Does the suffering never end, Ken? I mean,
not like that.
All of those things that can go wrong involve, exquisite suffering.
It certainly does, and certainly is. I mean, the Buddhist Three Noble Truths. I mean, the mark of existence is dukkha, And what that really means is separate self-existence. So if you can get into a state where you're no longer a separate subject confronting a world of other or object, then you are transcending the suffering, not necessarily pain. Pain can still arise, but you're no longer identified with it, so it doesn't turn into suffering. So there are ways out of suffering, and they involve these transformations of consciousness into broader and deeper and higher and wider states of consciousness that eventually transcend and include the entire universe, a supreme identity with everything that's arising moment to moment. And in that state, there's no suffering, but there's plenty of pain, and there's plenty of things that are generating suffering in masses of human beings that aren't awakened to their supreme identity. And that's almost always, apparently, going to be the case, because we're always born at square one. The Upanishads say wherever there is other, there is fear. And it's one of the first things humans learn to do is differentiate self and other. And as soon as they do that, welcome to fear. And they're stuck with it as long as self versus other is real.
So one can meet one's demise like Joan of Arc or a gazelle in the jaws of a lion, where it's actually an ecstatic experience.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw monks in Vietnam setting themselves on fire and not flinching.
Isn't that something?
No.
Yeah, no.
So those are possible, and that is worth remembering.
Well, I think we need to rethink suffering because and death, because it's so sticky, and so this ought not be, and it clearly is, and it's clearly okay with God. So it has to be okay with us.
Yeah, I know. That's why there's a book that is in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And, well, actually, there are two books by this one writer. One was called Who is This God Person Anyway? And the other was 53 More of God's Biggest Mistakes. And I always love that title because I can think of 53 right now.
Me too.
It's just,
I mean, if this is God, I mean, I'm not sure I want to, be part of this.
I know. Well, that's what all these theodicies, there was a whole, philosophical fashion of coming up with a theodicy, which was trying to show why, that this was not the best of all worlds, but the best of all possible worlds. So that if you want to have, sensitivity to stuff and be sensitive to pleasure, then you're going to also have to be sensitive to pain. It really doesn't make any sense to have one of those without the other. Mm-hmm. So, all of these opposites come into being, and we try to gather all the positive opposites, all the pleasure and all the good and all the joy and all the love, and none of the fear, none of the hate, none of the pain, none of that. But that's like wanting a world with all ups and no downs, and all lefts and no rights, and all ins and no outs. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work like that. If you want any of those positives, you got to take those negatives with them, or you're not going to get a manifestation. You're not going to get a yin and a yang up and running. So you can't really get anything manifest. And
I just want to say that I wish that it could.
Yeah. Well, I know. It's sort of,
I wish we could have the ups and not the downs.
And exactly. And it's exactly people wanting that makes them continue to invent things that make things a little bit better. So that's all good.
Yeah. But also to just embrace the negative, embrace death. I mean, embrace the sort of transitory nature of this existence, and even to see the ecstasy in suffering, I think is a challenge. It's a challenge for me. It's one of the things I'm working on, and God bless us all.
Indeed, it is. it's a strange and wonderful world.
Oh, Ken. Well, you have illuminated so much of this strange and wonderful world to so many of us.
Bless
and
you, my friend.
I am so grateful and so happy to have talked to you for this last 90 minutes, for goodness sakes.
Of course.
So, yeah.
Anything
so thank
for
you
you
so much for being. Oh,
okay,
thank you, Ken. And it's so much.
You bet.
Thank you so much for being part of my 100th episode. And more
An
to
honor.
come.
An
Yeah,
honor.
indeed.
Thank you, buddy.
All right. Thanks, Ken.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.